Okay, respectful. Unmitigated temerity to feel sorry for a white woman has had to put his word against two white peoples. I need not remind you of their appearance and conduct on the stand. You saw them for yourselves. The witnesses for the state, with the exception of the sheriff of Macomb County, have presented themselves to you gentlemen to this court in the cynical confidence that their testimony would not be doubted, confident that you gentlemen would go along with them on the assumption, the evil assumption, that all Negroes lie, that all Negroes are basically immoral beings, that all Negro men are not to be trusted around our women, an assumption one associates with minds of their caliber, which, gentlemen, we know is in itself a lie, as black as Tom Robinson's skin. A lie I do not have to point out to you. You know the truth, and the truth is this. Some Negroes lie. Some Negroes are immoral. Some Negro men are not to be trusted around women, black or white. But this is a truth that applies to the human race and to no particular race of men. There's not a person in this courtroom who has never told a lie, who has never done an immoral thing. And there's no man living who has never looked upon a woman without desire. Atticus paused and took out his handkerchief. Then he took off his glasses and wiped them. And we saw another first. We had never seen him sweat. He was one of those men whose faces never perspired, but now was shining tan. One more thing, gentlemen, before I quit. Thomas Jefferson once said that all men are created equal, a phrase the Yankees and the distaff side of the executive branch in Washington are fond of hurling at us. There's a tendency in this year of grace, 1935, for certain people to use this phrase out of context to satisfy all conditions. The most ridiculous example I can think of is that the people who run public education promote the stupid and idle along with the industrious. Because all men are created equal, educators will gravely tell you that children left behind suffer terrible feelings of inferiority. We know all men are not created equal in the sense some people would have us believe. Some people are smarter than others. Some people have more opportunity because they're born with it. Some men make more money than others. Some ladies make better cakes than others. Some people are born gifted beyond the normal scope of most men. But there is one way in this country in which all men are created equal. There's one human institution that makes a pauper, poor person, the equal of a Rockefeller, rich person. The stupid man, the equal of an Einstein. And the ignorant man, the equal of any college president. That institution, gentlemen, is a court. It can be the Supreme Court of the United States or the humblest JP court in the land, or this honorable court which you serve. Our courts have their faults, as does any human institution. But in this country, our courts are the great levelers. And in our courts, all men are created equal. I'm no idealist to believe firmly in the integrity of our courts and in the jury system. That is no ideal to me. It is a living, working reality. Gentlemen, a court is no better than each man of you sitting before me on this jury. A court is only as sound as its jury, and a jury is only as sound as the men who make it up. I'm confident that you gentlemen will review without passion the evidence you've heard, come to a decision, and restore this defendant to his family. In the name of God, do your duty. Okay, so at criminal court, you need all 12 to agree on conviction. You only need one person to say, I kind of don't think, and then you have a hung jury, and then the state can choose to prosecute a new trial with a new jury, or they can not prosecute the case again. O.J. Simpson got one juror out of 12, and then the state decided not to prosecute again. But then the families sued in civil court for money damages. In civil court, you only need a majority on the jury. Atticus' voice had dropped, and as he turned away from the jury, he said something I did not catch. He said it more to himself than to the court. I punched Jem. What'd he say? In the name of God, believe him. I think that's what he said. Dill suddenly reached over me and tugged at Jem. Look yonder! We followed his finger with sinking hearts. Calpurnia was making her way up the middle aisle, walking straight toward Atticus. She stopped shyly at the railing and waited to get Judge Taylor's attention. She was in a fresh apron and she carried an envelope in her hand. Judge Taylor saw her and said, "It's Calpurnia, isn't it?" "Yes, sir." "Could I pass this note to Mr. Finch, please, sir? It hasn't got anything to do with the trial." Judge Taylor nodded, and Atticus took the envelope from Calpurnia. He opened it, read its contents, and said, "Judge, this note is from my sister. She says my children are missing. Haven't turned up since noon. I know where they are, Atticus," Mr. Underwood spoke up. "They're right up yonder in the colored balcony. Been there since precisely 1:18 p.m. Our father turned around and looked up. "Jem, come down from there," he called. Then he said something to the judge we didn't hear. We climbed across Reverend Sykes and made our way to the staircase. Atticus and Calpurnia met us downstairs. Calpurnia looked peeved, but Atticus looked exhausted. Jem was jumping in excitement. "We've won, haven't we?" "I've no idea. You've been here all afternoon? Go home with Calpurnia and get your supper and stay home." "Oh, Atticus, let us come back, please. Let us hear the verdict, please, sir." Notice how I skip she said, he saids. I highly recommend that strategy for you. It not only makes me a faster reader, since I move my lips when I read and write, it also makes it more fluent. And therefore, when it's more fluent, easier to read, it makes it easier to comprehend. And when I can comprehend easier, I can analyze deeper. And like Charity says, pull more rabbits out of the metaphorical hat, or in this case, text.
Well, you do different voices for every character too. It's not like you're like doing the same voice for each character.
And I highly recommend that as well. When you're moving your lips, you don't have to say it out loud, but just make your lips do a different accent. It's like a brain trick. The jury might be out and back in a minute. We don't know. And juries can be out for seconds or days or weeks. But we could tell Atticus was relenting. "Well, you've heard it all, so you might as well hear the rest. Tell you what, you can come back when you've eaten your supper. Eat slowly now, you won't miss anything important. And if the jury's still out, you can wait with us. But I expect it'll all be over before you get back." "You think they'll acquit him fast?" Atticus opened his mouth to answer, but shut it and left us. I prayed that Reverend Sykes would save our seats for us, but stopped praying when I remembered that people got up and left in droves when the jury was out. Tonight, they'd overrun the drugstore, the OK Cafe, and the hotel. That is, unless they had brought their suppers too. Calpurnia marched us home. "Skin every one of you alive. The very idea you children listen to all that. Mr. Jem, don't you know better than to take your little sister to that trial? Miss Alexander'll absolutely have a stroke of paralysis when she finds out. Ain't fitting for children to hear." The streetlights were on, and we glimpsed Calpurnia's indignant profile as we passed beneath them. "Mr. Jem, I thought you was getting some kind of head on your shoulders. The very idea. She's your little sister. The very idea, sir. You ought to be perfectly ashamed of yourself. Ain't you got any sense at all?" So black people, even disciplining in that situation, still calling him Mr. and Sir, and speaking to the guy. I was exhilarated. So many things had happened so fast, I felt I would take years to sort them out. And now here was Calpurnia giving her precious Jem down the country. What new marvels would the evening bring? Jem was chuckling. "Don't you want to hear about it, Cal? Hush your mouth, sir, when you ought to be hanging your head in shame. You go along laughing." Calpurnia revived a series of rusty threats that moved Jem to little remorse, and she sailed up the front steps with her classic, "If Mr. Finch don't wear you out, I will. You get in that house, sir." Jem went grinning, and Calpurnia nodded tacit consent to having Dill to supper. "You call Miss Rachel right now and tell her where you are. She's run distracting looking for you. You watch out she don't ship you back to Meridian first thing in the morning." Aunt Alexandra met us and nearly fainted when Calpurnia told us where we were. I guess it hurt her when we told her Atticus said we could go back, because she didn't say a word during supper. She just rearranged food on her plate, looking at it sadly, while Calpurnia served Jem, Dill, and me with a vengeance. Calpurnia poured milk, dished out potato salad and ham, muttering, "Shame on yourselves," in varying degrees of intensity. "Now you all eat slow," was her final command. Reverend Sykes had saved our places. We were surprised to find that we had been gone nearly an hour, and were equally surprised to find the courtroom exactly as we had left it, with minor changes. The jury box was empty, the defendant was gone, Judge Taylor had been gone, but he reappeared as we were seating ourselves. So the jury is out still. This jury in 1935 in Confederate bi-cell breed humans, Alabama, Jim Crow, don't read, black people can't vote, ha ha, hang them to death in a tree or off a bridge, no prosecution, no, not even an arrest, Alabama. The jury's still out deliberating.
So he's a good lawyer. Right.
This should have been a 2-seconder. Nobody moved hardly, said Jem. They moved around some when the jury went out, said Reverend Sykes. The men folk down there got the women folk their suppers, and they fed the babies. How long have they been out? About 30 minutes, Mr. Finch, and Mr. Gilmore did more talking, and Judge Taylor charged the jury. How was he? What say? Oh, he did right well. I ain't complaining one bit. He was mighty fair-minded. He sort of said, if you believe this, then you'll have to return one verdict, but if you believe this, you'll have to return another one. I thought he was leaning a little to our side. Reverend Sykes scratched his head. Jem smiled. He's not supposed to lean, Reverend, but don't fret. We've won it. Don't see how any jury could convict on what we heard. Now, don't you be so confident, Mr. Jem. I ain't ever seen any jury decide in favor of a colored man over a white man. But Jem took exception to Reverend Sykes, and we were subjected to a lengthy review of the evidence with Jem's ideas on the law regarding rape. It wasn't rape if she let you, but she had to be 18, in Alabama that is, and Mayella was 19. Apparently you had to kick and holler. You had to be overpowered and stomped on, preferably knocked stone cold. If you were under 18, you didn't have to go through all this. Mr. Jem, this ain't a polite thing for little ladies to hear. She doesn't know what we're talking about. Scout, this is too old for you, ain't it? It most certainly is not. I know every word you're saying. Perhaps I was too convincing because Jem hushed and never discussed the subject again. What time is it, Reverend? Getting on toward 8. I looked down and saw Atticus strolling around with his hands in his pockets. He made a tour of the windows, then walked by the railing over by the jury box. He looked in it, inspected Judge Taylor on his throne, then went back to where he started. I caught his eye and waved to him. He acknowledged my salute with a nod and resumed his tour. Mr. Gilmer was standing at the windows talking to Mr. Underwood. Bert, the court reporter, was chain smoking one after the other. He sat back with his feet on the table. But the officers of the court, the ones present, Atticus, Gilmer, Taylor, sound asleep, and Bert were the only ones whose behavior seemed normal. I'd never seen a packed courtroom so still. Sometimes a baby would cry out fretfully and a child would scurry out, but the grown people sat as if they were in church. In the balcony, the Negroes sat and stood around us with biblical patience. The old courthouse clock suffered its preliminary strain and struck the hour 8, deafening bongs that shook our bones. When it bonged 11 times, I was past feeling tired from fighting sleep. So now it's 11. They're still deliberating.
So it's been a couple hours?
Like 5 or 6 hours, or 4 or 5 at least. I allowed myself a short nap against Reverend Sykes' comfortable arm and shoulder. I jerked awake and made an honest effort to remain so by looking down and concentrating on the heads below. There were 16 bald ones, 14 men that could pass for redheads, 40 heads varying between brown and black, and I remembered something Jem had once explained to me when we were through a brief period of psychical research. He said if enough people, a stadium full maybe, were to concentrate on one thing, such as setting a tree afire in the woods, that the tree would ignite on its own accord. I toyed with the idea of asking everyone below to concentrate on setting Tom Robinson free, but thought if they were as tired as I, it wouldn't work. Dill was sound asleep, his head on Jem's shoulder, and Jem was quiet. Ain't it a long time? Sure is, Scout. Well, from the way you put it, it'd just take a few minutes. 5 minutes. Jem raised his eyebrows. There are things you don't understand, he said, and I was too wary to argue, but I must have been reasonably awake, or I would not have received the impression that was creeping into me. It was not unlike one I had last winter, and I shivered, though the night was hot. The feeling grew until the atmosphere in the courtroom was exactly the same as a cold February morning when the Mockingbirds were still and the carpenters had stopped hammering on Miss Maudie's new house, and every wood door in the neighborhood was shut as tight as the doors of the Radley place, a deserted, waiting, empty street, and the courtroom was packed with people. A steaming summer night was no different from a winter morning. Mr. Heck Tate, who had entered the courtroom and was talking to Atticus, might have been wearing his high boots and lumber jacket. Atticus had stopped his tranquil journey and had put his foot onto the bottom rung of a chair, and as he listened to what Mr. Tate was saying, he ran his hands slowly up and down his thigh. I inspected Mr. Tate to say any minute, "Take him, Mr. Finch." Like I expected him to say, "Take him home." But Mr. Tate said, "This court will come to order," in a voice that rang with authority, and the heads below us jerked up. Mr. Tate left the room and returned with Tom Robinson. He steered Tom to his place beside Atticus and stood there. Judge Taylor had roused himself to sudden alertness and was sitting up straight, looking at the empty jury box. What happened after that had a dreamlike quality. In a dream, I saw the jury return, moving like underwater swimmers, and Judge Taylor's voice came from far away and was tiny. I saw something only a lawyer's child could be expected to see, could be expected to watch for, and it was like watching Atticus walk onto the street, raise a rifle to his shoulder and pull the trigger, but watching all the time knowing that the gun was empty. A jury never looks at a defendant it has convicted, and when this jury came in, not one of them looked at Tom Robinson. The foreman handed a piece of paper, this sounds like Jocelyn, to Mr. Tate, who handed it to the clerk, who handed it to the judge. I shut my eyes. Judge Taylor was polling the jury. Guilty, 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 guilty. I peeked at Jem. His hands were white from gripping the balcony rail, and his shoulders jerked as if each guilty was a separate stab between them. Judge Taylor was saying something. His gavel was in his fist, but he wasn't using it. Dimly, I saw Atticus pushing papers from the table in his briefcase. He snapped it shut, went to the court reporter and said something, nodded to Mr. Gilmer, and then went to Tom Robinson and whispered something to him. Atticus put his hand on Tom's shoulder and whispered. Atticus took his coat off the back of his chair and pulled it over his shoulder. Then he left the courtroom, but not by his usual exit. He must have wanted to go home the short way because he walked quickly down the middle aisle toward the south exit. I followed the top of his head as he made his way to the door. He didn't look up. Someone was punching me, but I was reluctant to take my eyes from the people below us and from the image of Atticus's lonely walk down the aisle. Miss Jean Louise. I looked around. They were standing all around us in the balcony, and on the opposite wall, the Negroes were getting to their feet. Reverend Sykes' voice was as distant as Judge Taylor's. Miss Jean Louise, stand up, your father's passing. So they rise as if it's like a king or queen leaving a ceremony.
Do you need a second thing?
No. Thank you, though. It was Jem's turn to cry. His face was streaked with angry tears as we made our way through the cheerful crowd. "It ain't right," he muttered all the way to the corner of the square where we found Atticus waiting. Atticus was standing under the street light looking as though nothing had happened. His vest was unbuttoned, his collar and tie were neatly in place. His watch chain glistened. He was his impassive self again. "It ain't right, Atticus." "No, son, it's not right." We walked home. Aunt Alexandra was waiting up. She was in her dressing gown, and I could have sworn he had on her corset underneath it. "I'm sorry, brother," she murmured. Having never heard her call Atticus brother before, I stole a glance at Jem, but he was not listening. He would look up at Atticus, then down at the floor, and I wondered if he thought Atticus somehow responsible for Tom Robinson's conviction. "Is he all right?" Auntie asked, indicating Jem. He'll be so presently. It was a little too strong for him. I'm going to bed. If I don't wake up in the morning, don't call me." "I didn't think it wise in the first place to let them." "This is their home, sister. We've made it this way for them. They might as well learn to cope with it." "But they don't have to go to the courthouse and wallow in it. It's just as much Macomb County as missionary teas." "Atticus." You are the last person I thought would turn bitter over this. I'm not bitter, just tired. I'm going to bed. Atticus? He turned in the doorway. What, son? How could they do it? How could they? I don't know, but they did it. They've done it before, and they did it tonight, and they'll do it again. And when they do, it seems that only children weep. Good night. But things are always better in the morning. Atticus rose at his usual ungodly hour and was in the living room behind the mobile register when we stumbled in. Jem's morning face posed the question his sleepy lips struggled to ask. It's not time to worry yet. He says that a lot. Atticus reassured him as we went to the dining room. We're not through yet. There'll be an appeal. You can count on that. Gracious alive, Cal. What's all this? He was staring at his breakfast plate. Calpurnia said, Tom Robinson's daddy sent you along this chicken this morning. I fixed it. You tell him I'm proud to get it, but they don't have chicken for breakfast at the White House. What are these? Rolls? Estelle down at the hotel sent them. Atticus looked up at her, puzzled, and she said, You better step out here and see what's in the kitchen, Mr. Finch. We followed him. The kitchen table was loaded with beans, even scuppernongs. Atticus grinned when with enough food to bury the family. Hunks of salt pork, tomatoes, beans, even scuppernongs. Atticus grinned when he found a jar of pickled pig's knuckles. Reckon Auntie will let me eat these in the dining room. Calpurnia said, This was all around the back steps when I got here this morning. They appreciate what you did, Mr. Finch. They don't overstep in themselves, are they? Atticus' eyes filled with tears. He didn't speak for a moment. Tell them I'm very grateful. Tell them they must never do this again. Times are too hard. Okay, I gotta stop.